The galaxy collapses. We were wrong to exile you. Please, you must help us.
50 years ago, the Galactic Assembly voted 412 delegations to 9 to remove humanity from the core of civilized space and resettle every living human being on a dead rock at the edge of the galaxy. A system so far from the trade lanes that light from the Assembly's own capital took 11,000 years to reach it. They called it a resettlement. They called it a humanitarian relocation. The word exile never once appeared in the official record, because the delegations who wrote that record were ashamed of what they were actually doing, even as they did it. Humanity had been in civilized space for only 61 years at that point, barely long enough to build its first embassy. And already 412 species had decided the safest place for humans was as far away from everyone else as the laws of physics would allow. This is the story of what those 412 species found 5 decades later, when they came back to that same dead rock on their knees, asking humanity to save them. The vote itself took less than a day, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how frightened the Assembly was. Humanity had done nothing wrong, not in the way that mattered to any court that would have judged them fairly. They had simply done everything too well, too fast, in a galaxy that had spent 11,000 years learning to be comfortable, and comfort does not forgive competence. In their first decade among the stars, humans had solved 3 engineering problems that older species had listed as unsolvable for over 1,000 years. In their second decade, human physicians had cured 2 diseases that had killed members of the Vayan Conquered for as long as the Conquered had kept written records. By the 5th decade, human shipwrights had built a drive core 40% more efficient than anything in assembly service, using scrap alloys and a mathematical shortcut that 3 different alien engineering academies had dismissed a century earlier as theoretically impossible. The Assembly did not fear a human war. There had never been one, not against any of them. What the Assembly feared was arithmetic. Species that grow this fast, the older delegations argued in closed session, eventually dominate everything around them, not through malice but through sheer accumulating advantage, the way a single degree of extra warmth turns rain into drought over enough centuries. Better to remove the variable now while it was still small, while the removal could still be called mercy instead of what it actually was. 412 votes in favor, 9 votes against, cast by delegations too small and too poor to matter, whose objections were recorded and then filed somewhere nobody ever read them again. Humanity was given 6 months to evacuate every colony, every station, every embassy inside the boundaries the Assembly still called civilized space, and resettle in a system named, with what can only be described as bureaucratic irony, refuge. Refuge had one habitable world, a cold, iron-heavy planet with a thin atmosphere and soil that grew nothing recognizable as food without decades of terraforming humans would have to invent themselves, because the technology to accelerate the process was, naturally, restricted to species already inside the boundary humanity had just been thrown out of. The Assembly called this a fresh start. Humanity's ambassador, a woman named Elena Marsh who had spent 4 years building relationships across a dozen alien governments only to watch every one of them vote for exile without so much as a private apology, called it something else in her final address before the transports left. She stood in front of the cameras that would broadcast to every human being about to be relocated across 40 light-years of empty space, and she said only this: "They think they are burying us. Let's show them what grows in the dark." Nobody in the Assembly paid much attention to that sentence at the time. They had bigger things to worry about, mostly each other, mostly the slow-grinding political rivalries that had defined the core worlds for millennia before humans ever arrived to complicate things, and then, conveniently, be removed again. The 9 species who had voted against exile drifted back into irrelevance. The 412 who had voted for it moved on with the business of running a galaxy, satisfied that the human problem had been solved the same way every problem in the Assembly's long history had eventually been solved. Quietly, bureaucratically, and permanently. They were wrong on all three counts, though it would take them the better part of 5 decades to understand exactly how wrong. And by the time they did, the price of admission back into humanity's good graces had become considerably higher than an apology. Refuge, when the first transports arrived, was everything the surveys had promised and nothing the surveys had prepared. Anyone for? The sky was the color of a healing bruise, yellow-brown from atmospheric dust that never quite settled. The wind carried a fine iron grit that got into everything: machinery, lungs, the seals on the emergency habitats that had to be built in the first 72 hours, or the first wave of settlers would not survive the planet's first hard winter. There was no help coming. There would be no help coming, not from the Assembly, not from any of the 412, because the terms of exile were explicit. Humanity would receive no further material support, no technology transfers, no diplomatic assistance, and no contact beyond the automated beacon that would relay any formal communication the Assembly ever chose to send. Humanity was, for all practical purposes, being buried alive on a planet that did not want them, with nothing but what they had managed to load onto the transports and whatever was left of their own stubbornness. It turned out to be enough. It turned out, over the following 5 decades, to be considerably more than enough. But nobody watching those first ships descend through Refuge's dust-choked atmosphere would have believed it, least of all the 412 delegations who had already stopped thinking about the species they had just thrown away. Among the 400,000 settlers who stepped off those transports was a 19-year-old propulsion apprentice named Tomas Adami, who had spent his entire short career learning to maintain drive cores he would now never fly, because every ship that had carried humanity to Refuge was under Assembly seal to depart within a week and never return. He remembered standing at the base of the ramp with his tool case in one hand and watching the transport that had carried his family lift off into that bruised yellow sky. And he remembered thinking, with the particular clarity that only real fear produces, that everyone he had ever known was now standing on this single dead rock, and there was no version of the future in which someone else was going to fix this for them. He also remembered years later that this was the exact moment he stopped being afraid, because fear is a luxury that requires the possibility of rescue, and once that possibility was gone, all that was left was work. The colony's first governor, a former orbital logistics administrator named Naomi Cho, had not wanted the job. She took it anyway on the third night after landing, standing in a half-assembled emergency shelter while wind screamed against the polymer walls, and a woman 2 shelters down was giving birth without a working medical bay, because someone needed to make decisions, and she was the only person in the room who had ever managed a project with more than 10,000 moving parts. Her first order as governor was not about food or shelter. It was about information. She ordered every scrap of engineering knowledge, every agricultural manual, every medical text anyone had thought to bring, copied and distributed to every shelter cluster within 48 hours, because she understood something the Assembly's exile planners had entirely failed to account for. You cannot isolate a species that has already learned to write things down. The first winter killed 11,000 people. It is a number the colony still marks every year, quietly, without ceremony, because ceremony felt like something they could not yet afford. The cold on Refuge did not arrive gradually. It arrived in a single week, temperatures dropping faster than any weather model the settlers had brought with them predicted, because the models had been built for worlds humans actually understood in Refuge. It turned out, obeyed none of the comfortable assumptions of Earth or any colony humanity had settled before. Shelters failed. Crops planted in soil nobody had finished analyzing died in the ground. In the town that would later be named Marsh's Landing, after the ambassador who had refused to let the exile be the end of the story, 300 people crowded into a single reinforced hangar meant for 40. and survived the winter by doing something that would become, without anyone planning it, the defining trait of the entire colony. They stopped waiting for someone to solve the problem and simply started solving it themselves in public out loud, so that whatever one person learned belonged to everyone by morning. Thomas Adami spent that winter not maintaining drive cores but tearing them apart. The transports had left their old orbital shuttles behind as scrap, useless without fuel refineries that existed only in assembly territory. But a drive core is, underneath all its complexity, a very elegant machine for moving heat and energy from one place to another. And heat was the one thing 400,000 freezing settlers needed more than anything else on the planet. By the second month of that winter, Tomas had converted 11 scrapped shuttle cores into heating plants capable of keeping an entire shelter cluster alive through temperatures that would have killed everyone inside within hours. He was 19 years old and had never designed anything in his life. He had simply refused to accept that a piece of technology built for one purpose could not be forced, through stubbornness and a slide rule and 3 sleepless nights, into serving another. It was the first small proof of something the Assembly's exile planners had never bothered to model, because none of the 412 species who voted for exile had ever needed to understand it. Humans did not treat technology as something handed down from an authority to be used correctly. They treated it as raw material. Every rule about how something was supposed to work was, to the human mind, less a law of nature and more a suggestion made by someone who had simply not tried hard enough yet. By the end of that first brutal year, the colony had buried 11,000 of its own, and built, from wreckage and desperation and borrowed textbooks, the beginnings of an industrial base that would have taken most assembly colonies a full generation to establish under ideal conditions. Naomi Cho called a meeting in the spring, in the half-finished council hall that would later become the heart of the planetary government, and she said something that Tomas Adami, by then a foreman overseeing 40 engineers half his age who had learned everything they knew from him, would repeat to his own apprentices for the rest of his life. She said that the Assembly had given humanity exactly one gift by accident in the process of trying to erase them, and that gift was silence. Nobody was watching. Nobody was grading them against a standard, judging whether their solutions were elegant or their methods respectable by whatever aesthetic the older species preferred. For the first time since first contact, humanity was free to be exactly as strange, as relentless, and as unapologetically resourceful as it needed to be, with no one left to disapprove. Refuge's second winter killed 400 people. Its third killed 60. By the 5th year, the colony had stopped losing anyone to the cold at all, and had instead begun exporting a small but growing surplus of refined ore to nowhere in particular, stockpiling it in warehouses built from scrap, because Naomi Cho had a theory she shared with almost no one outside her inner council. A galaxy this large, this old, this comfortable would eventually run into a problem it did not know how to solve. And when that day came, she wanted humanity to have something the rest of the galaxy needed badly enough to finally have to ask. 15 years is a long time for a species to be forgotten, and the Assembly forgot humanity thoroughly. There was no malice left in the forgetting by then, only the ordinary erosion of memory that happens to any inconvenient subject in a bureaucracy old enough to have outlived 100 crises before this one. New delegates were seated who had never cast the original vote. Historians filed humanity's exile under a chapter heading that translated, roughly, as resolved matters, and moved on to write about newer disputes among older, more familiar neighbors. On refuge, the opposite was happening. Every year that passed without contact was another year the colony had to solve its own problems with its own hands. And every solved problem became a tool for solving the next one, until the tools themselves began to compound into something the Assembly would not have recognized even if it had bothered to look. By the colony's 10th year, refuge had cracked the soil problem, not through any technology borrowed or stolen, but through a decade of relentless, almost obsessive agricultural experimentation led by a woman named Priya Raghunnathan, who had been a botanist's assistant back on Earth and became, through necessity and stubbornness, the closest thing the colony had to an accelerated terraforming authority. She did not have the restricted technology the Assembly used to green a hostile world in a single generation. What she had was 200 failed harvests, a network of amateur scientists trading notes across every settlement on the planet, and an absolute refusal to accept that a problem solved by someone else's machine could not eventually be solved by hers. By year 12, Refuge was not merely feeding itself. It was producing grain varieties engineered to survive dust storms and iron-heavy soil that no Assembly Agricultural Academy had ever attempted to grow, because no Assembly world had ever needed to. By year 20, Tomas Adami, no longer an apprentice but the head of what the colony now called the Forge Authority, had turned his wartime improvisation with scavenged drive cores into something genuinely new. A propulsion architecture built not around efficiency, which required exotic materials Refuge did not have, but around redundancy and repair engines that could be rebuilt in the field from common alloys by anyone with basic training and a manual, because Refuge had learned the hard way that a perfect machine nobody could fix when it broke was worth less than an imperfect one anyone could. It was a philosophy the Assembly's engineers would have called primitive. It was also, though nobody on Refuge knew this yet, exactly the kind of engineering an aging, brittle, over-specialized galactic civilization would eventually need more desperately than anything else it owned. The colony had by then developed something else the Assembly had never planned for and would not have believed if told: a culture. Refuge held festivals on the anniversary of the first winter, not to mourn but to remind its children what had been survived. Schools taught engineering not as a discipline learned from certified instructors but as a birthright, something every child was expected to attempt, fail at, and attempt again, because that was simply how things were done here. A new generation was growing up who had never seen Earth, who knew the 412 delegations only as a story their grandparents told about the day the galaxy decided humanity was too dangerous to keep close, and who carried that story not as a wound but as an inheritance, the way other cultures carry founding myths about surviving floods or exiles or long winters that made them who they were. It was during Refuge's 23rd year that the first strange signal reached the colony's listening array, a modest network of receivers Tomas Adami's engineers had built almost as an afterthought, more out of habit than expectation, since the Assembly's beacon had sat silent and unused for 2 decades. The signal was not a message. It was noise, the accidental leakage of encrypted Assembly communications bleeding across a boundary nobody thought Refuge's primitive receivers could detect, let alone parse. It took Refuge's cryptographers, self-taught from decades-old textbooks and pure persistence, the better part of a year to extract anything coherent from the noise. What they found was fragmentary, alarming, and entirely unconfirmed. References to failures in something called the Long Circuit, references to 3 Assembly member worlds going dark within the same 18-month period, references to an emergency session of the Assembly Council that had been called, and then within days, sealed under a level of secrecy, the colony's cryptographers had never seen used in any of the older leaked communications they had catalogued. Naomi Cho, by then an elder stateswoman well into her 70s, called a closed council meeting the night the analysis came back, and she said very little because there was very little that could yet be said with certainty. What she did say, according to the minutes that would only be declassified decades later, was that a galaxy this vast did not go quiet by accident, and that whatever was happening at the core of Assembly space, humanity would very likely be the last species anyone thought to warn. She ordered the listening array expanded. She ordered Tomas Adami's engineers to quietly begin cataloging every piece of surplus industrial capacity the colony had built over 2 decades of enforced self-reliance. Not for use, not yet, but for accounting, the way a careful person keeps an inventory of what they own before deciding whether to sell it. Refuge had spent 23 years being buried alive by a galaxy that wanted nothing more to do with it. Nobody on that dust-colored planet yet understood exactly what was breaking apart in the bright, crowded, comfortable worlds at the center of civilized space. But for the first time since the exile, Naomi Cho allowed herself to say out loud, in a room full of people who had survived the impossible together, that whatever was coming, it was going to need something only a species like theirs had ever bothered to build. To understand what was breaking in the center of the galaxy, you first have to understand what the Assembly had built its entire civilization on top of, and what it had quietly stopped understanding a very long time ago. Every major world inside Assembly space, every shipyard, every city, every hospital and farm and orbital habitat drew its power and its communications, and most critically, its faster-than-light navigation data from something the Assembly's own historians called the Long Circuit. A network of relay stations and gravitic anchor points scattered across 11,000 light-years of space, built not by any of the 412 member species, but by a civilization that had vanished so completely so long ago that not even their names survived, only their infrastructure and the fossilized certainty of everyone who depended on it. The Assembly had spent 11,000 years living inside a system they had inherited rather than built, maintaining it through inherited protocols nobody had originated, repairing it through inherited manuals nobody had authored, and somewhere in that vast stretch of comfortable inheritance, the plain, unglamorous skill of understanding a machine well enough to build a new one from nothing had quietly atrophied out of every civilized species in the galaxy. Nobody noticed the atrophy because nobody needed to notice it. The Long Circuit did not fail. It had not failed in 11,000 years, and an institution that reliable stops being treated as a machine at all and starts being treated as a law of nature. The way a species that has never seen a river run dry stops imagining that rivers can run dry. The first relay station went dark in a system called Perrin Vey, quietly, without fanfare, dismissed by Assembly engineers as a routine maintenance fault that would resolve itself within days, because nothing in 11,000 years of operation had ever suggested otherwise. It did not resolve itself. 11 days later, a second relay went dark in an unrelated sector 4,000 light-years away, and this time Assembly engineers actually opened an access panel that had not been opened in over 6 centuries, and found to their genuine horror that they had no idea what they were looking at. The internal architecture bore only superficial resemblance to the training simulations every Assembly engineer had studied for their entire careers. The manuals, it turned out, had been simplified generations ago into procedures for routine servicing, because nobody currently alive had ever needed to understand the actual underlying engineering, only the checklist for keeping it running. A counselor named Vex Oduya, representing one of the mid-tier delegations on the Assembly Council, was the first official to say out loud, in a closed session that would later be leaked in fragments across the Long Circuit's own dying communication network, the sentence that would eventually define the crisis for everyone who lived through it. We do not know how to build the things we depend on, and we have known this without saying it for longer than any of us are willing to admit. The panic that followed was not immediate. It moved the way panic always moves through institutions built for comfort rather than urgency, slowly at first, buried under committee formations and diplomatic reassurances. Until the third relay failed, then a fourth, and 3 member worlds went completely dark within an 18-month span. Their populations plunged into blackout, their orbital defenses inert, their FTL navigation reduced to dead reckoning across distances that made dead reckoning a death sentence for any ship that tried it. The Assembly convened its emergency session in a chamber that had not seen a genuine crisis debate in over 4 centuries, and the sealed minutes that would leak, eventually, into Refuge's patient cryptographers described a room full of representatives from 412 species discovering together that their entire civilization had been quietly hollow at its foundation for longer than any of them had lived. Every proposed solution collapsed under the same fundamental problem. Assembly shipwrights, trained for 11,000 years to maintain, not invent, could not reverse engineer a precursor architecture none of them had built. Assembly research academies, structured around consensus and peer validation across dozens of aging institutions, could not move fast enough to matter. Their processes designed for careful centuries-long study rather than the 18-month collapse now unfolding around them. There were, in that entire glittering, comfortable, 11,000-year-old civilization, remarkably few people left who had ever built anything from nothing, because building from nothing had not been necessary in longer than anyone could remember. It was Vex Oduya, 3 weeks into the emergency session, who raised the question nobody wanted to be the one to ask, because asking it meant admitting something the Assembly had spent 50 years trying to forget it had ever done. There was, she reminded the chamber, a precedent, exactly once in Assembly history, for a species solving an unsolvable engineering problem through nothing but improvisation and unbroken stubbornness, using scavenged materials and first principles thinking instead of inherited manuals. She did not enjoy saying the next part. Neither did anyone in the chamber enjoy hearing it. But the record shows she said it anyway, into a silence that stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Humanity had spent 50 years on a planet with no inherited technology to lean on at all, building everything they owned from raw material and desperation. And if any species left in the galaxy still remembered how to construct a machine instead of merely operating one, the Assembly had exiled the only candidates to the one place nobody had thought to check. The vote to send an envoy to refuge was not unanimous. It was not even close. Old grudges, old fears, and older pride nearly buried the proposal 3 separate times over the following 2 months, while a fourth relay flickered and steadied and flickered again, buying the Assembly a borrowed handful of weeks it did not know how to spend. But desperation, in the end, is a more persuasive diplomat than pride ever manages to be. And on a gray, tense morning in the Assembly's capital, a single ship was quietly authorized, staffed with the Council's most reluctant volunteers, and sent on the 11,000-year-old trade lanes toward a dust-colored world at the very edge of the galaxy that its own crew had never once expected to visit in their lives. While the Assembly Council argued in sealed chambers over whether pride could still afford the luxury of silence, the crisis was no longer an abstraction to the people actually living through it. On one of the 3 worlds in the Corvine Reach system, a physician named Dena Shari spent the last months before the relay's collapse rationing power across a hospital that had once run on more electricity in a single hour than her grandmother's entire home district used in a year. She kept a private log during those months, later published after the crisis ended as part of a widely read memoir, describing nights spent operating by hand-cranked light while surgical equipment that depended on stable current sat unused in dark storage rooms, and describing, with an honesty that struck many readers across Assembly space as almost unbearable, the particular helplessness of an advanced civilization discovering that its advancement had never actually been its own. Dena Shari was not a soldier and had never been trained to think in terms of strategy or survival, and yet she found herself, like millions of others across the failing worlds of the long circuit, relearning skills her own species had abandoned so long ago that relearning them felt less like recovery and more like archaeology. She taught herself, from digitized records nearly 1,000 years old, how to set a bone without a diagnostic scanner. She organized her neighbors into rotating shifts to hand-pump water when the automated systems failed, something her own great-grandparents would have found unremarkable, and something her own generation found almost impossible to imagine doing without guidance from some higher authority telling them it was allowed. It was precisely this experience, repeated across 3 worlds and hundreds of millions of people, that made the Assembly Council's eventual capitulation to humanity's terms far less controversial among ordinary citizens than the delegates themselves expected. By the time Vex Oduya returned from refuge with the negotiated terms in hand, The populations of the failing worlds had already spent the better part of a year discovering exactly how little their comfortable civilization actually understood about the machinery it depended on. And they were, by then, considerably less interested in questions of pride than the diplomats arguing on their behalf. Denashari would later write that the day power was restored across Corvin Reach, she did not think first of the engineers who fixed it. She thought of her grandmother and of every generation before her stretching back 11,000 years, who had lived comfortably enough for long enough to forget that comfort is not the same thing as safety, and that a civilization which stops asking how its own miracles work is a civilization quietly betting its entire future on nothing ever going wrong. That same lesson, delivered independently and almost simultaneously to hundreds of millions of people across dozens of worlds, did more to reshape the Assembly's political culture in a single year than any council vote could have accomplished on its own. Delegations that had spent 50 years treating the exile of humanity as a settled, uncontroversial footnote found themselves, for the first time, fielding genuine public anger from constituents who wanted to know why an entire species capable of solving the very crisis now threatening their homes had been thrown away rather than simply included from the start. It was not guilt alone that drove the eventual reforms to the Assembly's charter. It was the far more practical, far more durable realization, shared across 412 delegations, and articulated most bluntly by ordinary citizens rather than career diplomats, that a civilization too afraid of new ideas to let them grow nearby was a civilization perpetually one crisis away from discovering it had no idea how to save itself. Denashari eventually corresponded briefly with Halima Akoy, the two of them exchanging messages across the reopened trade lanes long after the immediate crisis had passed. A physician and an engineer from opposite ends of a galaxy that had nearly torn itself apart through comfortable inherited ignorance. In one of those letters later, included with Den's permission in the official Assembly archive on the crisis, she wrote that she envied more than anything else the particular kind of confidence Halima's generation carried with them, the assumption, bone-deep and entirely unremarkable to them, that any broken thing could eventually be understood if you were simply willing to take it apart and stop waiting for someone else's permission to try. Halima wrote back only a few lines, but they were lines that would later be carved, along with several others from the crisis, into a memorial wall built jointly by human and assembly engineers at Corvin Reach, marking the exact spot where the first relay had been saved. She wrote that the confidence Den envied had never come free. It had been paid for in full by 11,000 people who never got to see what it eventually built, and that the only honest way to carry an inheritance like that was to make sure it kept being useful to somebody. The ship the Assembly sent was called the Quiet Accord, a name chosen by a committee that clearly hoped the mission would be exactly that, and its crew spent the entire 11,000-year journey along the old trade lanes rehearsing an apology none of them had written yet, because nobody in the delegation could agree on how much of one the Assembly was actually willing to give. Vex Oduya led the mission herself, against the advice of nearly every colleague on the council, because she had been the one to say the sentence that started this. And she believed, with a conviction that surprised even her, that whatever answer humanity gave deserved to be received by someone willing to look them in the eye while receiving it. What the Quiet Accord censors found approaching refuges system was the first sign that 50 years of silence had not gone the way the Assembly assumed. There were no derelict transports rusting in orbit, no scattered emergency habitats clinging to survival at the edge of failure. None of the quiet, diminished desperation the Council had privately, guiltily expected to find. There were shipyards. Not large by Assembly standards, but active, humming with traffic orbital rings strung with modest but unmistakably functional industrial platforms that had clearly been designed, built, and expanded entirely without a single piece of Assembly technology to copy from. There were satellites in a precise, elegant lattice around the planet, A communications and defense network built from principals Vex Oduya's own engineers would spend months afterward trying and failing to fully reverse engineer. And there, on the dust-colored world below, sprawling far beyond the modest founding settlements the original exile records described, were cities. The Quiet Accord was met not by desperate refugees grateful for any contact with the wider galaxy, but by an orbital traffic control system that politely, firmly, and without a trace of the deference the Assembly had grown used to receiving from smaller powers, instructed the ship to hold position at a designated boundary until clearance was granted. It took 6 hours. Vex Oduya spent every one of them staring out at a planet the Assembly's own records still listed, in some outdated administrative database nobody had bothered to correct, as an uninhabitable relocation site of marginal long-term viability. The delegation that finally came aboard the Quiet Accord to receive them was small, deliberately so, and led by a woman named Aisha Marsh, granddaughter of the ambassador who had spoken the final words humanity heard before the transports left assembly space 50 years earlier. Aisha had grown up hearing her grandmother's voice recording as a kind of scripture, "They think they are burying us. Let's show them what grows in the dark." And she had spent her entire adult life in the planetary government precisely because she wanted to be in the room if the day ever came that the rest of the galaxy remembered humanity existed. She was flanked by an old man named Tomas Adami, now in his late 60s, who had once converted scavenged drive cores into heating plants during a winter that killed 11,000 people, and who now oversaw an industrial base that produced more refined ore and finished alloy per capita than 3 mid-tier assembly member worlds combined. Vex Oduya had rehearsed an opening statement for 11,000 light years. She abandoned it the moment Aisha Marsh sat down across from her, because the apology she had planned suddenly felt smaller than the room deserved. What she said instead, plainly, without the diplomatic softening the Assembly's protocols usually demanded, was this: "The Assembly is dying from the inside, we do not know how to fix what is breaking, and we came here because you are the only people left who might." Aisha Marsh did not answer immediately. The record of that meeting, which would eventually become required reading in schools on both sides of the negotiation for different reasons, describes a silence that stretched long enough for several of the Assembly delegates to begin quietly rehearsing worse outcomes. When Aisha finally spoke, she did not raise her voice, and she did not gloat, though every human aboard that shuttle would have forgiven her if she had. She asked a single question instead: "Do you know why the vote to exile us passed 412 to 9? Vex Oduya, to her credit, did not deflect. She answered honestly because there was no version of this negotiation that could survive being built on another comfortable lie. The Assembly, she said, had been afraid of a species that solved problems too quickly, that grew too fast for anyone else to feel safe standing near. Aisha nodded slowly and then said the thing that would be quoted, translated into every language spoken across Assembly space for the rest of that generation. "You were afraid we would outgrow you," she said, "so you cut us off from everything we had and left us nothing to grow with except each other. And now the thing you were afraid of has happened anyway. It just happened somewhere you couldn't see it, on a planet you decided wasn't worth watching." Nobody in that shuttle spoke for a long moment afterward. Then Tomas Adami, who had spent 50 years turning wreckage into salvation and had very little patience left for ceremony, leaned forward and asked the only question that actually mattered. He wanted the specifications of the failing relay stations, every fragment of data the Assembly's engineers had managed to gather, and he wanted to know exactly how much time they believed they had left before the failures became irreversible. Vex Oduya gave him everything because there was, at that point, nothing left to protect by withholding it, and because some part of her, watching this quiet, weathered man study data his own homeworld's exile had never intended him to see, understood that the negotiation had already ended before it properly began. The only question left was what humanity was going to ask for in return. News of the Quiet Accord's arrival spread across refuge within hours. carried by the same planetary broadcast network Naomi Cho had ordered built decades earlier for the express purpose of making sure no piece of important information ever belonged to only a few people at a time. The reaction was not uniform, and it was not simple, because 50 years of exile had left different wounds in different generations, and those wounds did not all point toward the same conclusion. In the old cemetery outside Marsh's Landing, where the victims of the first winter still lay under simple iron markers cut from the same scrap that had once heated their shelters, an elderly woman named Grace Osai stood among the graves the evening the news broke, and told a local reporter with more calm than anger that she had buried a husband and 2 children in that ground because a galaxy full of frightened neighbors decided humanity was too dangerous to keep close, and that she did not know yet whether she had it in her to help save the descendants of the people who made that vote. Her interview aired planetwide that night, and it was not the only one like it. In the agricultural provinces, where Priya Raghunathan's decades of soil experimentation had finally turned a hostile world into something that could feed itself and more younger farmers who had never known anything, but Refuge argued in town meetings that helping the assembly now, from a position of strength instead of desperation, was the only way to make sure a vote like the original exile could never happen to anyone again, human or otherwise. Aisha Marsh read every one of those town meeting transcripts personally before the final council vote, because she had promised herself, the day she entered public life, that she would never let a decision this large be made by leadership alone, insulated from the people who would actually have to live with its consequences. She held 3 open forums across the planet's largest population centers in the 2 weeks between the Quiet Accord's arrival and the Council's final terms, and she deliberately did not attend as a moderator or an authority. She attended as a resident of Marsh's Landing whose own grandmother's voice recording had shaped the entire culture of the colony, and she listened publicly without defending a position, while thousands of ordinary people worked through 50 years of grief and pride in real time. What emerged from those forums more than any single argument was a kind of exhausted, hard-won clarity that surprised even the council members who had called the meetings. Refuge's people did not want revenge, not really, not once they said it out loud in front of their neighbors and heard how it sounded. What they wanted again and again, in different words from different mouths across 3 different cities, was to never again be the ones without a voice in the room, where decisions about their survival were made. They wanted the 412 delegations to have to sit across a table from humanity as equals, not as supplicants and not as conquerors. And they wanted every future generation on every world in the assembly to grow up knowing exactly what had been done to Refuge and exactly what Refuge had built anyway, so that fear of another species' success would never again look like an acceptable policy to anyone holding a vote. It was this clarity, more than any speech from the council floor, that shaped the final terms Aisha Marsh brought back to Vex Oduya. And it was this same clarity that Tomas Ademi carried with him months later into the access corridor of a dying relay station at Corvain Reach, because he understood better than almost anyone else on the mission that he was not simply repairing a piece of ancient machinery. He was proving, in front of an entire galaxy that had once decided humanity's competence was too dangerous to tolerate, exactly how right they had been to be afraid, and exactly how wrong they had been to think burying that competence would ever make it disappear. The council meeting that followed the Quiet Accord's arrival was held in the same hall where Naomi Cho, 50 years earlier, had told a room full of frightened survivors that the assembly had accidentally given humanity the one gift it needed most. Naomi herself was 94 now, too frail to serve in any formal capacity, but she sat in the back of the chamber that night at Aisha Marsh's insistence, because some decisions, Aisha said, deserved to be made in front of the people who had bled to make them possible at all. The debate was not gentle. There were voices in that room, and they were not few, who argued that the assembly deserved nothing, that 412 species who had thrown humanity onto a dying world and called it mercy had no standing to ask for rescue now that their comfort had finally caught up with them. A counselor named Priya Raghunathan's grandson, a sharp, furious young representative from the agricultural provinces, stood and said what many in the room were thinking but had been too careful to say aloud. Let them learn to build something from nothing the way we did, on their own dying world, and see how quickly they discover mercy is easier to demand than to earn. It was Tomas Adami, silent for most of the debate, who finally spoke the words that shifted the room. He reminded the council that he had spent his entire life turning scrap into salvation, not because scrap deserved saving, but because the people standing on it did, and he did not believe humanity had survived 50 years of exile only to become the kind of species that let strangers die out of spite it had every right to feel. He was not arguing for forgiveness. He was arguing for something colder and, in its own way, more devastating. That humanity should help the assembly not because the assembly deserved it, but because doing so on humanity's own terms, in humanity's own time, using knowledge the assembly had spent 11,000 years failing to develop, was the only form of justice that would actually be remembered. Aisha Marsh let the debate run its full course, because she understood that a decision made too quickly would not hold, and this was a decision the entire colony needed to own together. When the vote finally came, it was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming, and the terms that emerged from that long night were deliberately, precisely engineered to be impossible for the assembly to refuse and impossible for anyone ever again to mistake for charity. Humanity would repair the long circuit. In exchange, the assembly would grant Earth and Refuge both full, permanent, and equal membership on the council, with voting power proportional to population rather than the seniority-weighted formula that had let 412 species outvote humanity's 9 allies half a century earlier. Every archive, every technology, every trade route the assembly had sealed away during the exile would be opened, not as a gift, but as a debt repaid. And the original vote, the 412-9 that had sent humanity to the edge of the galaxy to die quietly and be forgotten, would be entered permanently into the Assembly's founding charter alongside the record of what happened afterward, so that no future generation of any species, human or otherwise, could ever again pretend that fear of another people's competence was an acceptable reason to bury them alive. Vex Oduya carried those terms back to the Assembly Council personally, and the record of that session, unsealed and made fully public within the year, shows a chamber that argued for exactly 1 day before capitulating, because the alternative, laid out in stark and unforgiving detail by Vex Oduya herself, was watching civilization collapse world by world while pride finished the job fear had started. 50 years earlier, the vote to accept humanity's terms passed 390 to 21, a margin that would have been unthinkable before the crisis, and entirely predictable to anyone who understood exactly how little choice was actually left in the room. Tomas Adami did not wait for the ink on the agreement to dry before assembling his engineering teams. He had, after all, spent his whole life learning that the only cure for a machine breaking down was to stop admiring the problem and start taking it apart. And somewhere out among the dying relay stations of the long circuit, an entire galaxy's worth of comfortable inherited civilization was waiting to find out exactly what 50 years of being underestimated had actually built. The relay station chosen for humanity's first repair attempt sat in a system called Corvain Reach, home to nearly 400 million people across 3 inhabited worlds, all of them now living on emergency reserves, as the local node of the long circuit flickered through its final weeks of function. It was, deliberately, the hardest possible test the assembly could have offered, and Tomas Adami accepted it without hesitation, because he understood, the way Naomi Cho had understood 50 years earlier in a freezing shelter with a woman giving birth 2 doors down, that the first proof anyone gives of what they can do is the one people remember forever. He did not bring the largest team humanity could assemble. He brought 40 engineers, most of them under 30, all of them trained in a tradition that had never once in its history been handed a manual and told to follow it without question. Among them was a woman named Halima Akoy, who had grown up in Marsh's Landing hearing stories of the first winter from grandparents who lived it, and who had spent her entire career specializing in exactly the kind of first principles, reverse engineering the Assembly's own academies, had quietly forgotten how to teach. When the team finally opened the access panel on Corvain Reach's dying relay, the same panel that had reduced assembly engineers to genuine despair months earlier, Halima did something none of the Assembly's own specialists had thought to try. She stopped looking for what the machine was supposed to do and started measuring what it was actually still doing, tracing every surviving current and gravitic pulse back to its source with instruments her own team had built from scratch specifically for this mission. Because Refuge had never inherited a schematic for anything and had therefore never lost the habit of building the tool before building the solution. What she found 3 days into an examination the Assembly's own engineers had abandoned as hopeless months earlier was that the relay was not actually failing the way everyone believed. It was starving. The precursor architecture, whatever ancient and vanished civilization had built it, had never been designed to run in isolation, node by node, the way the Assembly had treated it for 11,000 years of complacent, disconnected maintenance. It was designed to share load dynamically across dozens of neighboring relays in a network far more interdependent than anyone still living understood. And as more nodes failed elsewhere across the circuit, the survivors were being forced to carry burdens they were never meant to bear alone, collapsing in a slow, connected cascade that no single station repair could ever have stopped. It was, Halima realized, standing in that access corridor with grease on her hands and 40 exhausted engineers watching her work, almost exactly the same problem Refuge had solved by accident 20 years earlier, when Tomas Ademi first taught a generation of frightened teenagers to build heating systems that could share power and load across an entire shelter cluster, instead of failing one household at a time. The precursor builders, whoever they had been, had understood something the Assembly forgot the moment it stopped needing to understand anything at all. Redundancy is not a backup plan. It is the actual design. The fix, once identified, was not elegant in the way assembly engineering prized elegance, all clean lines and minimal intervention. It was brutal, improvised, and entirely, unmistakably human. Halima's team rebuilt the failing relay's load distribution using scavenged components and jury-rigged bridges between systems the original architecture had never intended to be manually reconfigured, exactly the kind of unauthorized, first principles intervention that would have horrified any assembly maintenance certification board. It also worked. Power stabilized across Corvain Reach within 9 days. Within 3 weeks, the relay was carrying more load more efficiently than it had managed in over a century of degraded assembly servicing, because Halima's team had not simply repaired what was broken. They had redesigned it using the same stubborn philosophy that had kept 400,000 exiled humans alive through a winter that should have killed them all. The news reached the assembly capital before the engineering reports did, carried by the frantic, disbelieving transmissions of 300 million people who had spent months preparing for the death of their entire civilization, and instead woke up one morning to full power restored across every world in the system. Vex Oduya, standing in the council chamber when the first confirmation arrived, would later say that she had expected relief. What she had not expected, and what genuinely undid her composure in front of the assembled delegates for the first time in her long career, was the accompanying data packet Tomas Ademi transmitted alongside the repair confirmation. A complete working schematic for retrofitting every remaining relay station in the long circuit using the same redundant, field-repairable architecture, offered freely without condition to every engineering academy in assembly space, because Naomi Cho had taught him 50 years earlier that information belonged to everyone the moment one person learned it, and some habits, it turned out, did not stop mattering just because the person practicing them had finally been given a seat at the table. The moment that nearly ended the entire mission came on the 6th night at Corvain Reach, and it did not appear in any of the official reports the Assembly later released to the public, because Vex Oduya, against her own instincts toward transparency, agreed with Tomas Adami that some near disasters are more useful as private lessons than public spectacle. Halima Akoy had identified the load-sharing flaw by then, and her team had begun the delicate work of manually rerouting power through the relay's failing architecture, a process that required bridging two sections of precursor technology that had never, in 11,000 years of assembly stewardship, been deliberately connected while both were still carrying live current. It went wrong within the first 90 seconds. A junior engineer named Farid Belhaj, monitoring the bridge from a secondary console, called out that the secondary conduit was drawing load nearly triple what their instruments had predicted. And for a handful of seconds that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives, the entire station's containment field flickered, dimmed, and very nearly failed in a system holding back forces that would have vented 400 million people's only remaining power source into hard vacuum. Halima did not hesitate, and she did not wait for authorization from anyone because there was no time left for anyone to give it. She rerouted the overload directly through the relay's oldest, most fragile original pathway, the one section of the precursor architecture her team had been most afraid to touch, on nothing more than a working theory she had sketched on a data slate 2 hours earlier and never fully tested. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that control room breathed. Then the containment field steadied, the draw evened out across both pathways exactly the way her theory predicted, and the station's ancient, unknowable engineering did something it had apparently been designed to do 11,000 years ago and simply never been asked to do since. It balanced itself. Farid Belhaj, 24 years old and shaking, would later say that he understood, in that exact moment, something his teachers back on Ember had told him for years without his ever quite believing it. He said that watching Halima make that call, with no manual to follow and no authority above her willing to take responsibility for the decision, taught him more about what humanity actually was than every history lesson about the exile combined. Nobody had given her permission to trust her own judgment. She had simply never been raised to wait for it. Vex Oduya, watching the readouts from an adjoining observation deck alongside 2 assembly engineers who had gone pale and silent the moment the containment field flickered, asked Tomas Adami afterward how his people could stand to work that way, making decisions of that magnitude with no formal review, no committee, no second opinion beyond the person standing next to them. Tomas considered the question for a long moment before answering, because he understood it was not really a criticism. It was the closest thing to genuine curiosity the Assembly's rigid, deliberative culture had left in it. He told her that Refuge had learned, in its very first winter, that a decision made too late to matter is worth exactly the same as no decision at all, and that somewhere in 11,000 years of comfortable consensus building, the Assembly had forgotten there was ever a difference between the two. Vex Oduya did not have an answer for that. She spent the remainder of the mission watching Halima's teamwork with an attention that had very little to do with her offic. Isle diplomatic duties, and by the time the final confirmation came through that Corvain Reach's relay was stable, she had begun quietly drafting, on her own initiative, a proposal to overhaul the Assembly's own engineering academies around a curriculum she had no formal authority yet to implement. It would take her another 6 years to get that proposal passed. She would later say it was the single hardest fight of her long career, harder even than negotiating humanity's original terms, because convincing an 11,000-year-old civilization to admit it needed to learn how to think again proved considerably more difficult than convincing it to admit it needed help. It took 11 years to fully retrofit the long circuit, a task that would have taken the Assembly's own institutions, by their own later admission, the better part of a century if they had ever managed it at all. Humanity did not do the work alone. Within 2 years of the Corvain Reach repair, engineering exchange programs were running in both directions along trade lanes that had been sealed for half a century, assembly academies sending their brightest students to train under instructors who had never held an official teaching certification in their lives. Human engineers traveling in the other direction to study archives and precursor records that Refuge, for all its stubborn ingenuity, had never had access to. It was not a rescue. Both sides in the years that followed were careful never to let it be remembered as one. It was instead something the Assembly's own historians would eventually describe, in language far more honest than anything they had written 50 years earlier, as the first genuine partnership in the Council's 11,000-year history, forged not out of comfort, but out of the specific hard-won recognition that no species, however old, however vast, could afford to assume it had nothing left to learn. Naomi Cho did not live to see the final relay come back online. She died in her sleep 4 years into the retrofit project, at 98, having spent her last lucid years watching a colony she once governed out of a half-collapsed emergency shelter become a full voting member of the very assembly that had tried to erase it. Aisha Marsh spoke at her memorial, in the same council hall where Naomi had once told a room full of frightened survivors that the assembly had given them the gift of being unwatched. And she said that her grandmother's words, spoken 50 years earlier at the base of a departing transport ramp, had finally, completely come true. They had wanted to show the galaxy what grows in the dark. What had grown was not merely a colony, not merely an industrial base, not merely an engineering tradition sharp enough to save a dying civilization. What had grown, Aisha said, was proof, permanent and undeniable, that a species could be buried by fear and rise anyway, not out of vengeance and not even entirely out of forgiveness, but out of the simple, stubborn refusal to let anyone else's judgment decide what they were capable of becoming. The Assembly's charter was formally amended in the 11th year of the retrofit, the same year the final relay station came fully back online across the entire long circuit, restoring power and navigation to every world the ancient network touched for the first time in over a decade. Alongside the record of the original 412-9 vote, exactly as humanity's terms had demanded, sat a new clause, written in careful, deliberate language that every delegation had been forced to debate and ultimately accept. That no member species could ever again be relocated, restricted, or isolated from the shared knowledge of the Council on the basis of its rate of growth alone, because fear of another people's competence had once nearly cost the galaxy everything it depended on. And history, the clause stated plainly, did not intend to allow that mistake to be quietly forgotten a second time. Tomas Ademi died old, decades later, on the same dust-colored world he had arrived on as a frightened 19-year-old apprentice with nothing but a tool case, and a stubborn refusal to accept that a broken thing could not be made to work again. He was buried, at his own request, not among the honored dead of the capital, but in the small cemetery outside Marsh's Landing where the 11,000 victims of the first winter had been laid to rest, because he never stopped believing that whatever he had built afterward belonged, in the end, to them. Refuge is not called Refuge anymore. Its people renamed it in the first year of full assembly membership to Ember, because a governor whose grandmother once stood at the base of a departing ramp and promised the galaxy would see what grew in the dark believed that a name should remember not the exile, but what survived it. It sits today at the edge of a very different galaxy than the one that tried to bury it, its shipyards training engineers from 100-member species, its universities teaching a philosophy of first principles resilience that the rest of civilized space had spent 11,000 comfortable years forgetting it ever needed. And on the anniversary of that first brutal winter, every year without ceremony, without grandeur, the people of Ember still gather quietly to remember 11,000 names, not because the galaxy demanded it of them, but because they were the ones who paid, in full, for everything that came after. The 412 delegations who voted to bury humanity at the edge of the galaxy got exactly what they feared most in the end. They got a species that grew too fast to be contained, too resourceful to be forgotten, and too stubborn to hold a grudge longer than it took to build something worth more than revenge. They simply never expected that when the day finally came to beg that species for help, it would answer not with the cruelty it had every right to show, but with something far harder to prepare for. The quiet, unshakable insistence on becoming exactly what it always could have been, whether the rest of the galaxy had been watching or not.